It is my honor to wish a 100th happy birthday to a great American and a fine man, Secretary George Shultz. George, congratulations on making it to the century mark, and keep on going.
A thousand thanks, George, and our heartfelt love and admiration for being a peerless friend and mentor to Gail and to me, and for the treasured time we have spent with you and with wonderful, delightful Charlotte, and for the 100 years of magnificent leadership as America's global role model of wisdom, courage, and goodness. God bless and Semper Fi.
George, congratulations and happy birthday on your 100th. Wow. And there's work to be done, and you're still doing it. Congratulations.
As a young guy, I admired you from a distance, and later I got the chance to watch you help lead our country up close and personal. Ever since, I've followed every word you've said or written, George, and I look forward to many more years of doing that. I'm going to use a term that should be used very rarely. George, you're a great American. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, George. What an incredible milestone. I want to thank you for everything you've done for our university, for the Hoover Institution, and for our nation. Your contributions in policy, teaching, business, and government service have had an outsized impact on countless lives here at Stanford and around the world. You're an inspiration to all of us. And at a personal level, I can't thank you and Charlotte enough for being such welcoming friends to me and Mary on our return to Stanford 4 years ago. We look forward to many more great times together. Happy birthday, George, and best wishes for the year ahead.
Mr. Secretary, this is Chris Eisgerber, President of Princeton University, and it's my pleasure to wish you an enthusiastic happy birthday. You are a great man, an extraordinary leader and public servant, and a spectacular Princeton Tiger. So from all of us here at Princeton University, we hope you have a wonderful 100th birthday. Happy birthday, George Shultz.
On behalf of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, I extend my heartfelt wishes to you, George, on this auspicious occasion. Your distinguished career in government, academia, and business has been an inspiration. Thank you for your lasting impact on Chicago Booth, where it's an honor for me to hold the George Pratt Shultz Chair. Congratulations and happy 100th birthday.
George, greetings from Cambridge, Massachusetts. As a beloved teacher, a brilliant scholar, a visionary leader, a public servant of the highest integrity, and a relentless champion for breakthrough technologies, you represent the very best of MIT. And George, if only we could bottle your energy, we could quit working on fusion. We could not be more proud of or more grateful for your service to the Institute, the nation, and the world. Happy birthday from all of us at MIT.
George, it's your friend Rob Portman, wishing you a very happy 100th birthday. Historians, as you know, call the 20th century America's century. I call the last 100 years the Shultz century. And what a difference you've made, my friend. A century of service and accomplishment, from your time in uniform as a proud Marine in the Pacific during World War II, to your service as a cabinet member and advisor to 4 different presidents, to your business successes and your academic contributions, and your ongoing work at Hoover as you advocate for a better future for every one of us. I know you and Charlotte are celebrating today, surrounded by your loved ones. I look forward to the next time we can get together and participate in yet another Hoover Policy Roundtable together. Godspeed, my friend.
Very best centenary birthday wishes. At so many points, I learned from your example. At OMB, you were the model of a director who was the exemplar of respecting the analytic work of career staff. At State, you were the secretary who from day one made clear you were determined to leave the institution stronger than you found it. And at Treasury, you were the secretary who treated all, inside and out, with respect. When the fourth plaque was put on the back of my cabinet chair, I was told that only 3 others had that honor, that you were one of them. And that made it all the more special. A few years ago, when you and I ran into each other at Tanglewood, people around us were delighted to see how happy we were to see each other, across generations, across party lines. And to me, it was just another example of the civility, the courtesy, and the mentorship that is George Shultz. Happy birthday, and all best wishes.
Congratulations to the gold standard of public servants of the past century, or any century. And to my favorite Princeton Tiger, happy 100th birthday, Mr. Secretary.
George, as you round the corner on your first century, the lesson may be that the key to longevity is good policy and outstanding public service, both of which you embody. But perhaps it was the clarity of your diplomacy. At the time we were together in Beijing, and a retired Chinese general looked at you and said, "America must get out of the Pacific." You calmly leaned across the table and said, "Bull," with an expletive I will not repeat. My friend, have a happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Secretary Shultz. Today, you are 100 years young. What a long, accomplished, and consequential life you've led, serving 2 presidents in 4 cabinet-level posts. Your continued engagement in public policy and your sage advice and perspective are inspiring. Happy birthday to a true patriot and his remarkable service to our country.
George, this is Leon Panetta, wanting to wish you the happiest 100th birthday. You've lived a century of great service to the United States of America. As an economic advisor, as the Secretary of Labor, as the first director of OMB, something that I was able to do as well. You were great Secretary of the Treasury and a great Secretary of State. You in many ways helped bring the Cold War to the end. And you also opened up relations with our Asian countries, particularly the ASEAN countries, to improve both our trade and our relationships in the Pacific. Look, the most important ingredient I think that people bring to these kinds of jobs is their humanity. And George, you are a very decent, dedicated, good man who believed that the country came first in whatever job you held. I think your greatest legacy is going to be that you never gave up trying to do good for this country. And when we join again to celebrate your 200th birthday, that legacy will still be very real for you and for all of us. God bless you, God bless Charlotte, and God bless our country.
Hello, George. Bill and I are overjoyed to wish you a happy 100th birthday. We're so grateful for all you've done and continue to do for our country and the world. I'll never forget how much it meant to have your help and support when I first became Secretary of State. You sent me the best gift, a teddy bear that sang, "Don't worry, be happy," when I squeezed its paw. I kept it in my office. At first it was a joke, but every now and then it really did help to hear that song. George, your commitment to diplomacy, your openness in thinking about the future, to borrow from the title of your new book, your willingness to tell it like it is, and your sense of humor and perspective have made our country, and yes, the world, better places. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we're sending all our best and warmest wishes to you and Charlotte.
Hi, George. Congratulations on your 100th birthday. I'll never forget the days we spent together doing negotiations with the Russians and others, and how you took care of me and how you helped my education in foreign policy after I had sort of left the Army. So I want to wish you a very, very happy day, and I wish you all the best in that, whatever the future holds.
So here's my song, my methodological tribute. A fact without a theory is like a ship without a sail, is like a boat without a rudder, is like a kite without a tail. A fact without a theory is as sad can be. But if there's one thing worse in this universe, it's a theory. I said a theory. I mean a theory without a fact.
What a spectacular tribute to George. It's my pleasure to, on behalf of Hoover, to welcome you to this celebration of George's 100th birthday. Because of the pandemic, we have been unable to physically gather, but this group, as we had hoped to pay tribute to George. And what we will all miss is the fully Charlottized version of a milestone celebration. George is a national treasure, as we've just heard, who has had such an incredible impact on this country as well as on much of the free world. So many of you with us on this Zoom call this morning have known and worked with George on important policy development and implementation of those policies over so many decades. We hope our presentations and discussions this morning will capture some of the incredible impact that George has had in his many years of public service. The amazingly high profiles and accomplishments of this morning's panelists in and of themselves say a lot about George and his legacy. One could think that at age 100, George might be slowing down a bit, but as his continuing writing of editorials, his continuing publishing of books, including his most recent co-authored with Jim Timby called A Hinge of History, George is not slowing down a bit. So with that, Condi, as you all know, is our new director at the Hoover Institution. She needs no introduction to any of you. She's an incredibly accomplished policy implementer and initiator. And so she is going to lead the tribute effort this morning. And so with that, let me turn it over to Condi Rice.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much for your leadership at Hoover as the head of the Board of Overseers. It couldn't be a more joyful day from my point of view when we gather together so many people who have been a part of George's life, so many people who have been a part of his extraordinary efforts and extraordinary successes in making the world a better place, and doing it from the perspective of somebody who has always believed in America and its special role and its special responsibilities. George, we asked a lot of people about words that would describe you, and one word that really kept coming up was patriot. Everybody knows what you have meant to the world, what you have meant to this country, and what you continue to mean. We love the fact that you love ideas. We love the fact that you love continuing to bring people together to share ideas. And we love the fact that you have touched so many lives in so many different areas. I've told the story many times that when I was asked to be Secretary of State, I called George Shultz and he said, it's the best job in government. And I thought to myself, George ought to know. He's had just about every important job in government. And indeed, we are going to hear from his colleagues, his friends, those who've collaborated with him over the years in various areas. And so I just want to thank everybody who is attending virtually. I want to thank everybody who's participating. I also want to say that George, Charlotte is there by your side. You've been very, very special all your life, but you became a lot more special when you married Charlotte. And so to George and Charlotte, I hope you enjoy these efforts to recall all that you have met and that we can gather in person next year for your 101st. The first person who is going to speak is General Jim Mattis of the Marine Corps, retired. I once made the mistake of saying to George something about his service and the fact that he was an ex-Marine. And I was quickly admonished. There are no ex-Marines, he said. Once a Marine, always a Marine. General Mattis, on behalf of the Marines.
Well, thank you, Secretary Rice, and a joyful, joyful day indeed it is. In the history of our republic, only 2 men have held 4 cabinet-level offices in their lifetime. And one of these patriots who serves so broadly is Secretary George Shultz, U.S. Marine, who served as the Director of Office of Management and Budget, the Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State. I mean, Dr. Rice, I only served as one secretary and still got me in psychological counseling. I have no idea how a man served in 4. But in salute to you today, the Marine Corps is forever proud, Mr. Secretary, to count you in its front ranks. So happy birthday from your Corps of Marines. And as you always say, and Condi reminded us, once a Marine, always a Marine. More important even than the posts that you held are your accomplishments in those posts. So extensive that his life story now fills books describing his Herculean efforts. The specific issues he moved forward in those posts are reminders of what an honest, devoted, and competent leader can do to make this world a better place. Those leadership examples are legion. And a couple of examples: he led extensive progress in equal education and job opportunity for all here in our country, even in parts of our country that had resisted implementing Supreme Court decisions that confirmed such opportunity was the law of the land. He orchestrated fundamental change by creating teamwork, countering racism at home. And he did so, most importantly, where others said there was no common ground. Yet by listening, by drawing out his fellow citizens' better instincts and applying his powerfully force of personality, he created common ground, and we as a people are better for it. Internationally, he led the effort that reduced over 75% of the nuclear weapons on Earth. In achieving this landmark decision in the midst of a Cold War by creating trust that could be verified, denying the centrifugal forces between us and the USSR, and building that trust where others dared not try. I can go on for hours about a man who brought equal parts competence and empathy, wisdom and management to every leadership post he held in his first 100 years of life. Much of that life was spent in service to our nation, an America he believed in so strongly that even from a distance, we who followed him could only believe in this great big American experiment ourselves. Secretary Shultz was a man whose name alone remains his passport to the trust in public life. At home and abroad, from domestic civil rights to international human rights,
This Marine combat veteran's word was his bond, reflected in his unapologetic stance on the moral challenges of the day. Where George Shultz stood, nothing could budge him, for like the Marine that he was and the Marine he remains today, he could not be deflected, for he made clear what he stood for and equally clear what he would not tolerate. When George Shultz spoke, you could take it to the bank. And as a result, he earned trust in our government and in our country that we were good for our word. Even among those inclined to doubt, they believed, and such was his power of ethical and humane example. In his own understanding of who he is, these posts in high government offices, these posts in repeated cabinet positions, dim in comparison to his formative experience in our Marine Corps. As a member of the greatest generation, it was his service as a Marine during World War II's merciless Pacific campaign that shaped him for the political battles incumbent in his personal mission, which is a responsibility that all Americans share. That is, to create a more perfect union for all our fellow citizens. Having lost Marines in combat, he experienced up close the worst aspects of mankind, but he didn't whine about the unfairness of the world or complain about his lot. Rather, he rolled up his sleeves and he willingly shouldered his responsibility to help create that better world. A world that he knew we could not, a world that we must not ignore, a world that demanded our attention and from which we must not retreat if we were to carry out our responsibility to turn over a better world to the next generation. It was as a Marine in a bitter war that this Princeton grad came of age, tutored by tough and world-wise sergeants, and shaped forever by boot camp wisdom and by what he witnessed commanding Marines under fire in the Pacific Islands. He was shaped, but not embittered by the experience of combat. Having seen the role that trust played among Marines when the chips were down, he carried that lesson into every aspect of his life, and trust, the coin of the realm, he called it, became his watchword forevermore. On a more personal note, when I left Hoover to serve as the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Shultz, you reminded me that doing my job well meant not wanting it too much. Thank you. Captain George Shultz, first, last, and always a U.S. Marine. Happy birthday, Mr. Secretary, and Semper Fidelis.
Thank you very much, General Mattis, for that wonderful tribute. And now we're going to turn to one of the areas that George has had such a huge impact on, and that's economics. Trained as an economist, a teacher of economics, a scholar of economics, and perhaps most importantly, a practitioner of economics. As director of OMB and also as Treasury Secretary, he's left an indelible mark on the way that we think about the power of markets, the power of the private sector, and the power of the innovation and creativity that they unleash. Joining us, the Honorable Nicholas Brady, former U.S. Secretary of Treasury, the Honorable Pedro Aspe, former Mexican Minister of Finance and Public Credit, and one who helped to shape the face of U.S.-Mexican relations with Secretary Shultz, the Honorable Hank Paulson, a former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and the Honorable Alan Greenspan, former Chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Secretary Brady.
Thank you so much. I want to repeat or cite an incident which I think is exemplary of George Shultz's effect on the world and certainly on the economic world, because I think it tells so much. George and I were in the redwoods of California at the Bohemian Grove with his guest, Helmut Schmidt, Europe's accepted leader of many things, but certainly of economics. And before I go into that a little bit, I remember his guest the year before was Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, who had a similar position in the East. When during the meeting with Helmut, where the matters of economics of both Germany and the whole of Europe were the center of discussion, a telephone call came in from President Reagan. President Reagan asked George to return to government as Secretary of State, replacing Secretary Alexander Haig. Well, that would seem like a simple thing to do, 2.5 hours north of San Francisco in the woods and way up on the side of a mountain. But later that day, the same day, I might say, transportation was arranged. And George, Helmut Schmidt, and I drove back to San Francisco to pack up for his return to Washington, giving up his job as president of the Bechtel Group. It wasn't an easy pack up because he had very little time to do it. But anyway, he packed it up, put all this stuff together, and the very next day he left for Washington. Helmut went back to Germany and I went back to New Jersey. But it simplified to me the clearness of George's mind as when the bell rings, you do something. I would only, rather than just go through the economic things that we talked about while George was talking at the Bohemian Grove, I would say that I think that the level of record of cabinet level appointments, which has been mentioned before, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, the OMB director, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Treasury, and of course, Secretary of State. While these were all different jobs, they all melded to give George a background that was really secondary to none, second to none. And it was a huge, huge accomplishment. But I don't want to go on and delve into the details, Connie, because it would there were so many. But I do say that, having been in all of these jobs, it all melded together and provided a background which is unique and unlimited, and in fact, I think a record. But even more, it defines a life that when called to serve your country, whether in military or private. Secretary Shultz went right at it. What an accomplishment. It defines a life that was always this way, and the previous speakers have spoken eloquently about what that meant, and all I could add is amen. They certainly did. Now, before I sign off, I do remember, Connie, this is a birthday party. And if Charlotte put it on, it would be an elegant birthday party. But we're separated by miles. We're separated by a disease that I'm sure the country will overcome in its time. But it is a birthday party. So I'd like to close, George, with happy birthday for both Kitty and myself, and carry on. Thank you so much for the pleasure of your friendship.
Yes, we'll go now to Mr. Aspe.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to tell you how I met George. It was 1988, the last year in office of the Mexican president Miguel de la Madrid, and we were entering to the so-called M-Buck period.
Is your phone in your pocket? Your phone.
However, we were very busy since we were losing control of inflation and rapidly heading into hyperinflation. It was at the time 180% and growing. We were really, really in danger of going completely to the hyperinflation. At that moment, I was just nominated for a year, the last year, to be Secretary of the Budget. And we knew that implementing only a traditional orthodox adjustment plan in an emerging economy with considerable inflationary pressures and inertia will almost certainly have led to economic recession, which will have been a considerable negative impact of the economy. Our challenge was how to achieve a rapid decrease in inflation without generating a recession with our own policies. Thus, we designed and implemented a relatively unorthodox plan. Let me explain myself. It was unorthodox since we were asking workers and the private sector for a pact or a truce to voluntarily freeze prices, voluntarily, while at the same time enacting a very drastic and orthodox fiscal and monetary policies to balance the budget and to absorb excess liquidity from the economy. Israel was starting to implement a very similar program at the time. We wanted our northern neighbor to understand what we intended to do. That also, we were using an unorthodox approach regarding prices. We were being very orthodox in the implementation of our fiscal and monetary policies. Our hope was to have their vote of confidence, even if they don't fully agree on how to achieve the goal. George was Secretary of State at the time, so I called his assistant to request a meeting, and she told me the following day, Secretary Shultz was not granting any appointments at the time. I was really worried, so I sent a letter to Secretary Shultz telling him that we have three things in common. We had a PhD in economics, we were both alumni from MIT, and I was his neighbor. I am a Mexican living next to the US. The letter got him the following day, and I got the appointment. I was nervous about the meeting since the relationship between President Reagan and President de la Madrid was not at the best at the time. In the first meeting, I explained to George what we intended to do. He listened very carefully. At the end, he just responded with a question. Pedro, do the private sector and labor leaders believe your plan will be successful? And I said, not yet. I understand that trust is the key, but they don't, not yet. And they have given us a truce of only 1 month. He then asked me to come back to Washington when I had better news. 2 months later, I call again. And I say to George, he asked me, do you have sufficient trust now in the plan or not quite yet? I said, I think I do. So he said, if you are sure, come. If not, Pedro, let's wait. So I said, no, we have it. So I responded that I now have the proof because finally we have the trust of the private sector and the labor unions. They have just agreed for an extension of the truce in 6 months. I responded that I now have that proof, and so he invited me to Washington, and we had one of the best meetings in my life. The US then started supporting us, supporting the Mexican plan, and to speak well about our adjustment and comprehensive macro adjustment. Small world. 2 years later, I was named, inflation came down in 6 months from 180 to 17%. 2 years later, I was nominated to be the Secretary of the Mexican Treasury, and I had to negotiate with Nicholas Brady as Secretary of Treasury. And who introduced me with Nick? It was, of course, you, George. And 2 years afterwards, it was NAFTA, and again, You help Mexico, you help your neighbors. Since then, I have been blessed with a great and lasting friendship with George, a great American, a great economist, a great politician, and a great neighbor. Thank you, George.
Thank you. Secretary Paulson.
So I'm delighted to be part of this, and I'm going to begin with a quick personal story. In May of 2006, I had a flashback to a meeting with George Shultz in his Treasury office in 1973. In 2006, I was leaving a lunch that President George W. Bush had hosted for the Chinese President Hu Jintao, and I had just turned down President Bush the night before. I turned him down for the second time. I didn't really hadn't learned the lesson which George had learned. I turned him down in his offer to be Treasury Secretary. And as I was walking out of the East Wing, looking toward Treasury, it was a beautiful day, and the flashback was amazing because I went back to the time when I was a kid, a devastated kid, because I was working in the Nixon White House. I joined 6 weeks before the Watergate break-in. And then, this was 73. My boss, John Ehrlichman, had left in disgrace. The former Secretary of Treasury, John Connally, had left in disgrace. And I thought back to the day when Ken Dam and Ron Brooks had invited me to sit in on a meeting at Treasury. There wasn't much going on in the White House after Watergate. And then I was looking for a role model, and boy, I'll tell you, I saw George Shultz just glowing with integrity, understated, analytically rigorous, and I had a hero. And I'll tell you, so as soon as I thought of that meeting, I regretted my decision. And fortunately, I had another chance because a few weeks later, Jim Baker called with the offer, and I decided to go to Treasury. Now, unlike some of the other speakers, my real working experience with George began after I left Treasury, because the two areas of focus I had were climate change and the environment and China. And in both of those areas, George is a real thought leader, an innovator, a role model, and I've really, really appreciated the opportunity to work with him. Beginning with climate change, after leaving the White House, one of the earliest things I did was work with a number of people, Mike Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, and of course, George Shultz, Bob Rubin, a number of others on this risky business study, which I think was a breakthrough study looking at the economic impact of climate change. And, George Shultz was, just an inspiration, analytically rigorous, and he gave this study great credibility based upon his reputation. Now, even before I began working with him on this, he was a hero because I cared about the environment. And I'm hearkening back to the days when the Republican Party, and I don't mean to be partisan here, I'm a bit embarrassed by what's happening today, but I looked back when the Republicans were leaders on the environment, the Nixon administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air and Water Act. And I think one of the most significant things that's been done with climate change what was the Montreal Protocol. And for the first time, really focusing on the depletion of the ozone layer. And who was the person who led the effort of the Reagan administration there? It was George Shultz. And so, again, I really appreciated his leadership and the opportunity to work with him on climate change. Secondly, China. This is a big area of focus of mine. And, George Shultz and I, share a very, very similar view that China represents a major challenge to the United States, that we need to be strong diplomatically, militarily, economically, but also feels very strongly that this bilateral relationship is extraordinarily important. And so he's been a real thought leader here. And I've very much really appreciated the opportunity, all the conversations we've had, and the ability to work with him. And you know what? To me, you've all said things about George Shultz, and I agree with all the positive things that have been said. But one thing that really, really stands out to me is this. When most people grow older, even those that retain their wisdom, they often get caught in the past and in old thought models, ways of thinking, and so on. And George is looking to the future. He's innovating. He's breaking new ground. And I'm going to cite two examples here with China and with the environment. I'm going to start with the environment. So I think most, people with an economic mindset, if they're thinking about how to really deal with the carbon emissions problem and challenge, they believe in markets and putting a price on carbon and a carbon tax. But a few years ago, there was a major innovation, which was, George working with Ted Halstead, getting support from Jim Baker. I was very supportive. Revolutionized a way to think about this in a way that appealed to conservatives. And this was a carbon dividend. And it was a really big breakthrough. And I'd say another thing I would cite was along about 2018, George Shultz led a really important study on China. And I think it was called something like governance, in an emerging world, or I don't remember exactly the title. But what I do remember was some of the work. And he pulled me aside. He did me the great honor. I was talking, about China at a Stanford event, and he came to the event and he pulled me aside and he asked me if I had read the work that had been done on really looking at the demography of China, the demographics, and the aging of the Chinese society. And of course, everyone knew of that. So I was trying to think I hadn't read it. And so I immediately read it. And, again, broke new ground. I mean, this went so much deeper. And this is a significant study showing one of the huge challenges that China has. So again, a great innovator. So I end by saying happy birthday to a great man. And to me, George, the thing that you do, if I would look around the whole world and say, who is that person in the whole world that I would look to is being my hero, would be you. And why? It's not just because you've made a huge difference in the lives of so many people and so many roles, but I think you are an example, which is so much needed, of enlightened leadership rooted in integrity and intellectual rigor. You rely on the facts. So I just love that song you sang about, a theory without facts, because boy, do I wish we had leaders singing that today. So George, happy birthday, and, to you, and so much love sending your way to you and Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Hank. And now to the Honorable Alan Greenspan. Alan?
I'm delighted to be here to help pay tribute to my good friend George Shultz.
not only because he is a national treasure, but because I'm happy to be with anyone who is older than I. On economics, George and I have always been natural allies. He was heavily influenced in his early years at the University of Chicago by Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, one of my mentors, who reinforced George's view of the importance of a free market economy. It was after George's years at Chicago that he came in 1969 to the Nixon administration, and we first connected our bond opposition to Nixon's wage and price controls. George reminded me of this in a letter he wrote to me 2 years ago. He had recently discovered a letter in the Hoover archives that then Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns had written to President Nixon in June of 1971. To restore confidence and get out of the then present economic malaise, Burns recommended a repressive wage and price policy. At the time, George, who had been Secretary of Labor, had become director of the Office of Management and Budget. In a speech he gave in 2017, he recounted how he sensed that wage and price controls were in the air in 1970 and spoke out against them, calling for patience in a talk entitled Steady as You Go. But Congress had voted to give the president power to institute them, and in August of 1971, of course, the president imposed them. These wage and price controls characterized the 1970s. Through 3 separate phases of these controls, George stood firm in his opposition to them, and in 1973, his patience exhausted, he resigned as Secretary of the Treasury. Unsurprisingly, the price controls turned out to be a disastrous economic policy, and George landed on the right side of history in his opposition. Of course, I ended up inheriting a flawed policy when I became President Ford's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors months later that year in August. And 6 months after letting the Nixon Cost of Living Council dissolve, Congress granted Ford's request to create a Council on Wage and Price Stability, which basically authorized the dreaded Whip Inflation Now program. To this day, when close friends like Al Hunt want me to get started, they come up with one of those old win buttons to remind me of the failed policy. Fortunately for the country, George was a key player during the 1980 primaries as chairman of the Reagan Economic Advisory Council. And of course, he returned to government as Secretary of State in 1982. Inflation was out of control, the economy was stagnant, and he became a key player in helping President Reagan give Fed Chairman Paul Volcker the political cover he needed to hang tough despite the approaching midterm elections. The policy worked, and the economy started taking off the next year. While my remit today is to speak about George's extraordinary contributions in so many cabinet posts,
helping shape economic policy. My wife, one of NBC's White House correspondents during the Reagan administrations, would not let me conclude without mentioning George's brilliant diplomacy during the high-stakes Reagan-Gorbachev summits, leading to the key openings that paved the way to the peaceful end of the Cold War. Nor could I finish without adding admiration for his wife, Charlotte, who has been such a partner in everything George has done, and to whom we can clearly credit his youthful spirit and continued vitality. Charlotte and George were kind enough to host an engagement party for Andrea and me in their beautiful home. It is a treasured memory. So, George, we salute you on your centennial as you remain as productive and intellectual presence as ever. Truly the man of the century. Happy birthday.
Thank you very much for those wonderful tributes to George and the economy. And Alan Greenspan has provided a wonderful bridge for us to George and diplomacy, and to talk about George's historic role as the Cold War was ending and going forward. The Honorable James Baker, former U.S. Secretary of State, the Honorable Thomas Pickering, a U.S. career ambassador, one of the highest ranking career ambassadors of all time, foreign service officers of all time, and the Honorable Carla Hills, the former U.S. Trade Representative, and all good friends of George. So please, I'm going to turn first to Secretary Baker.
Thank you very much, Connie, and happy 100th birthday, George. You know, you've always been my role model and mentor, and I'm very hopeful that I can continue to follow in your footsteps by hitting the century mark myself in 2030. I am one of a lot of foreign policy practitioners who regard you as a real giant in the annals of 20th century American diplomacy. Your close to 7 years as Secretary of State laid the groundwork for the peaceful end of the Cold War. And as your successor at the State Department, I know firsthand about the enormous respect and the high esteem that the denizens of Foggy Bottom held for you. Further, as President Reagan's White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Treasury during your years at State, I also know firsthand about the seamless relationship that you enjoyed with President Reagan. The Gipper trusted you. You will recall, I think, that one time during the Reagan administration, there was a fair amount of battling between the president's more ideological supporters and people like you and me at times there during the first Reagan term. People like you and me who were seen to be a bit more moderate. I'm quite proud of the fact that we were seen to be compatriots who worked closely together and who protected one another from the White House backbiting and intrigue that went on during that first Reagan term. I will never forget riding to a lunch at the Madison Hotel in the fall of 1983 when Mike Deaver offhandedly mentioned to me that President Reagan had decided to follow Bill Clark's advice for a leak investigation and ordered everyone strapped up to a polygraph machine. I told our driver to turn the car around and we headed straight back to the White House, where I interrupted a lunch that President Reagan was having with you and with Vice President George Bush. After I suggested to the president that perhaps he should not order the top officials in his administration to take lie detector tests, you spoke up with great sincerity and you said, "Mr. President, You'll only polygraph me one time, and then you'll get yourself another Secretary of State. You know, you always understood that speaking truth to power was a key element of the job of a high-level presidential advisor. And I know personally that President Reagan felt the same way. The relationship the two of you had was critical to the peaceful ending of tensions between the two superpowers, especially as you convinced the president to establish a rapport with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. There were many at that time, and you'll remember this, who thought that wasn't the best idea. But it laid the groundwork for the START I and START II treaties that were finally agreed to during the Bush 41 administration. Time does not permit me to recite a litany of the other many consequential achievements during your time as Secretary of State, particularly your dedication to seeking peaceful solutions to regional conflicts around the world. Whether it was establishing a dialogue with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or resolving the crisis between China and Taiwan over US arms sales to Taiwan, you always focused on realistic and pragmatic ways forward. Of course, you're still at it today with those efforts to embrace a world free of nuclear weapons, and as has been mentioned, your support of a sensible plan to reduce carbon emissions in the United States and around the globe. You remain dedicated toward building a better world, and all of us thank you for that. But above all, George, the thing that stands out the most to me about your time at State was the tremendous amount of respect that you had from world leaders around the globe. They admired your character, your honesty, and particularly your tireless dedication to looking at all sides of the complex foreign policy issues that confronted the United States. Now, you know, a minute ago, I said that you were my role model and mentor. By that, George, I mean that you went to Princeton, and so I went to Princeton. You went into the Marine Corps, and so I went into the Marine Corps. You became Secretary of the Treasury, and so I became Secretary of the Treasury. You became Secretary of State, and so I became Secretary of State. And as I see the energy and joy that you have for life today, at age 100, I would dearly love to continue following in your footsteps. But George, there's one thing that I, in all candor, have to tell you. When it comes to having a Princeton tiger tattooed on my butt, I draw the line. Happy birthday, George. You are a true friend and a great American patriot.
Thank you so much, Secretary Baker. And now to Thomas Pickering.
Thank you very much, Secretary Rice and Secretary Shultz and Mrs. Shultz. Secretary Shultz, many, many congratulations on your 100th birthday and many happy returns. And in the State Department, I learned many things from you and from others. And one of the great things I learned, and I just learned again, is never, never, never speak after James Baker. It is in many ways for me a particularly useful, important, and honorable occasion as someone who was a denizen of the State Department under your great leadership to have the opportunity to say a few words on this very, very important anniversary for you and for all of us. I remember when we first met and you recruited me from Nigeria to go to work in El Salvador. And you did it through being willing to see me in Washington because I had doubts both about my capabilities, but also about where we were headed. And I asked you where we were headed, and the first answer you gave me was, tell me where you think we should go. And I did. I had a few ideas. And he said, you know, I agree with most of that, and I would support you if you go to El Salvador. But he said, one of the things, and he did this very subtly, but it's a true representation of his negotiating perception and his honesty and integrity. He said, in effect, I won't let you go to El Salvador unless you're prepared to throw yourself into it. I did. He accepted me. He took me immediately to meet President Reagan and then to the press office of the State Department for an announcement. And my only question was, now can I call my wife? And he said, yes, of course you can. 3 weeks later, I learned another lesson from George Shultz that I think stayed with me forever. The Bureau of the State Department that dealt with El Salvador wanted to cancel elections due in a few months. And they explained at great length all of the pros and cons and the reasons. And in this large meeting in the Secretary's outer office, he stood up and said these few words, in effect, we are a democracy. We do not postpone elections. That ended it. The election turned out to be a triumph for someone who could bring change to El Salvador. The election turned out to be a point of uniting Salvadorans around the notion that they had an opportunity to speak about their own future for the first time. And the election brought world observers who came back believing we were now on a good track. That led to the end of the conflict years later, but through a negotiation and diplomacy that was important. You asked me next to go to Israel. And Israel had something called a national unity government, in which Shimon Peres was the first prime minister for 18 months, totally at odds with Yitzhak Shamir, who succeeded him. Most Israelis were amazed that Peres let Shamir take over. But Shamir was as entrenched against any discussions of the Middle East or association with the Palestinians as anyone I'd ever met. And you came to Israel a number of times. And through careful, logical, quiet, capable reasoning, brought Shamir on board that Jordan and the Palestinians would go together to a conference to negotiate, unrivaled, but certainly of great significance for our future. That didn't work for other reasons, but it set the pathway for future conferences, including keeping Shamir on board, and that was significant. You were a great teacher, Mr. Secretary, and I remember a few aphorisms which I think in many ways encapsulate what all of us learned from you. One was, trust is the coin of the realm. It needs no further explanation. Another was, diplomacy is like good gardening. You have to tend it every day. It requires small changes to make big ones. It requires constant attention, and it requires dealing with the new growth that constantly appears to be devil gardeners. A third was, when you're in a deep hole, stop digging. This was clearly a warning to all of us, Foreign Service and others alike, that while we were helpful in making policy, we also had to be helpful in figuring out when it didn't work. And when it didn't work, we had to come forward and say, not Mr. Secretary, this policy isn't working, but to say, Mr. Secretary, this policy isn't working, and here are the changes we need to make. And your final one was, show me your country. Secretary Shultz welcomed new ambassadors going out to the field in his office, and he had a large globe in the corner. And he pointed to show me your country when he wanted them to go at the globe and respond to his question. And the answer was not where you were going, but the question was what you represented, the United States and its interests. And that lesson stuck with all of us, whether we got to answer the question or not. It became, in effect, once again, a reminder that we served a great country and that we served great leaders. Mr. Secretary, it was always an honor to be with you. It was for all of us, foreign servants and civil servants alike in the State Department, a pleasure to work with you, someone who looked after us as our leader, taught us from your great experience, and in your own way conducted the diplomacy of the United States with great honor and great integrity. May you have many happy returns of this birthday. Thank you for the honor of coming to the birthday party with 7,000 miles of separation, and good wishes to you and to Mrs. Shultz.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pickering. And now to the Honorable Carla Hills. Carla?
Thank you, Condi. George, it is a joy and a great honor to join you with your many admirers in celebrating this 100th birthday. You are a true inspiration for all Americans. We are attracted by your towering intellect, unquestioned integrity, and passion for what is right, and also your capacity for fun. Your friends are legion, gathered from around the world and over the years, and you stand as a model. As Director of OMB, Secretary of Treasury, member of the Marine Corps, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of State, and you have consistently demonstrated an unwavering commitment to policy over politics. Many today have spoken about your outstanding, lasting impact at the State Department. For as Secretary, you set a model for excellence. Your list of achievement is long and includes diffusing tensions regarding trade disputes involving Japan, skillfully handling relationships with China, paving the way for the end of the Cold War with Russia, and building relationships with Latin America, and so much more. And you demonstrated that trust is critical in working with allies and in solving policy issues with adversaries. My interactions with you primarily occurred after your government service, and I can attest to you that in the private sector, you continue to demonstrate the diplomatic skills that are so fondly remembered here today. I recall well your expertise in organizing the North American Forum in 2005, bringing together thought leaders from the United States, Mexico, and Canada to discuss how, working together, we could make the North American region more prosperous and more secure. The forum focused on regulatory cooperation, free movement of people, improvement of border infrastructure, education, and more, all with the aim of creating a seamless, safer, more competitive North American market, and it worked. Trade and constructive interaction among our three countries multiplied. Collaboration improved. Your diplomatic skills were the driving force. It was not only your great ideas, it was your diplomacy and the bonds that you helped to build. Our discussions at the forum were accompanied by good fun. We enjoyed together, following and in the midst of our meetings. I have a great photo of you and your wonderful wife, Charlotte, dancing at a dinner followed by a meeting hosted in San Miguel. Pedro Aspe probably also remembers this event. The music played, smiles were broad, but importantly, a consensus was reached at the follow-up meeting the next morning. And your contributions have gone far beyond North America. I also have a great photo in my office that was taken in Beijing at one of our track twos put together by Henry Kissinger, organized in 2010. There we met with the top Chinese leadership, and your diplomatic skills were in full display and indispensable. When I reflect upon our bilateral relationship today, it underscores the need for diplomacy demonstrated by Secretary Shultz. You showed that if our leaders want to reach an agreement that would benefit the United States, they had better listen closely and choose their words carefully. For as Indira Gandhi is quoted as saying, you can't shake hands with a clenched fist. Diplomacy matters. And that wisdom also matters in the private sector. In addition to your ongoing leadership on a range of public policy issues from denuclearization to climate change and control of drug demand and supply, globalization, you have contributed brilliantly at the highest levels of the business sector. I was honored to serve with you on the Gilead board and clearly recall that as director emeritus, you never missed a meeting and you always came with a good idea. As Thomas Carlyle has said, the history of the world is but the biography of great men. And George, you've contributed some outstanding pages to our nation's history, and I have no doubt that you will continue to do so. I send you my heartiest and warmest congratulations on this milestone birthday. I have every confidence that your outstanding contributions to our nation will continue to benefit all Americans and indeed the world. Thank you so much and have a happy birthday.
Thank you very much. And obviously an enormous impact of our good friend and George Shultz on the world of diplomacy and the role, as someone said, you can't shake hands with a clenched fist. And even in the hardest of circumstances, George always understood that. Our last group is going to talk about what I think is maybe one of George's biggest, most audacious ideas. One that he actually began in discussions with President Reagan. Could the world actually be without nuclear weapons? Was it possible after that first use of nuclear weapons in 1945 to actually rid the world of nuclear weapons? We have become kind of accustomed to them as a part of the landscape of international politics. There are those who talk about deterrence and balance and so forth. But perhaps George and the colleagues we're going to hear from now still had a little bit in their consciousness of Oppenheimer's reaction when he first saw a nuclear explosion. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That we should never be completely comfortable with the nuclear age, that there are great dangers, existential dangers to humankind. And that work was done with Sam Nunn, the Honorable Sam Nunn, former US Senator from the state of Georgia, the Honorable William Perry, former US Secretary of Defense, the Honorable Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, and our own Sidney Drell, an internationally renowned physicist who understood the physics of nuclear weapons and wanted all to understand their dangers and to work to rid the world of them. And he is represented by our provost, his daughter, Persis Drell. Let me turn first to Senator Nunn. Sam?
Thank you very much, Condi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to add just one other person, a special person to that list, and that's George's wonderful, wonderful personal assistant, Susan Southworth, who has meant so much to all of us, continues to be a pillar of strength for George and Charlotte. So Susan, thank you for all you have done for all four of us and for George and Charlotte each and every day. I was recently asked to describe George Shultz in only 5 words, and that was a tough job. My initial list was pretty long, as you can imagine, but I finally settled on these 5. Number 1, courageous. Number 2, creative. Number 3, disciplined. Number 4, intrepid. Boy, is he intrepid. And number 5, fun. Now, the fun word may surprise some of you, given all the serious and daunting matters George Shultz continues to tackle. But George loves humor and he loves fun. His amazing wife, Charlotte, kicks it to a whole new level with her creativity, her energy, her love of life, and of course, her deep love for George. Who else but Charlotte Shultz would reserve a room at the North Beach Cafe in San Francisco, spread a truckload of sand under the table and around the room, and then fill the room up with beach balls? Only Charlotte. Speaking of fun, I hope that our friend General Jim Mattis will forgive me for relating an old Army jab at the Marine Corps. I'm sure he's heard it. It goes like this: what do you call a Marine that can read and write? And the Army answer is, you call him Commandant. Recently, some of George's friends thought that given his tremendous accomplishments and his many high offices, that the title Mr. Secretary was a bit inadequate, and they were searching for an alternative. Knowing that George remains the ultimate Marine, always faithful, they decided to address him as Commandant Shultz. They tried it a few times, but they gave it up because everyone thought they were talking about Charlotte. Now, Charlotte, thank you for all you continue to do for George and everyone he touches every day. And let's turn to the Shultz impact. A number of items have already been alluded to, but let me focus on the nuclear side. The first thing I would say is that I would thank Mr. Secretary for inspiring and supporting President Reagan and President Gorbachev in declaring jointly the principle that helped end the Cold War. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Today, that principle should again be explicitly acknowledged by every nation with nuclear weapons, and there are 9 of them now. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your leadership in preparing the groundwork for the end of the Cold War, which has been noted by Jim Baker and others. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for working with President Reagan and President Gorbachev to eliminate a whole class of destabilizing land-based medium-range nuclear weapons from the European theater. And thank you for your continued effort today to avoid a dangerous repeat of that history if these weapons are reintroduced by Russia and by NATO. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, when you were Secretary of State, for working closely with the Senate Arms Control Observer Group, co-chaired then by Senate leadership, Robert Byrd and Bob Dole, and committee chairs. You recognize that Senate ratification of important treaties required the opportunity for advice, for consultation, and for dialogue, as well as consent. As you say frequently, and I have heard it many times from you, in on the takeoff, in on the landing. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for leading the way on the Shultz, Perry, Kissinger, Nunn series of Wall Street Journal op-eds, which led off with this sentence, quote, U.S. leadership will be required to take the world to the next stage, to a solid consensus for reversing reliance on nuclear weapons globally as a vital contribution to preventing their proliferation into dangerous hands and ultimately ending them as a threat to the world. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your continued important leadership in urging the extension of the New START Treaty, which will expire as the last of our real bilateral treaties in early February of next year, and which includes, most importantly, the crucial verification provisions that are essential for trust but verify. And thank you also, Mr. Secretary, for urging the restoration of U.S. participation in the Open Skies Treaty, first championed by President Eisenhower and signed by President George H.W. Bush. So, George, You continue to be one of our nation and the world's most valuable public servants. You have done more in 100 years than most of us could do if we were given 400 years on earth. All of us, all of the people of the world really are blessed by your continued important work to bring about a peaceful and more stable world. And as Hank Paulson said so well, you're always looking to the future, which is absolutely amazing. George, your friend Bishop William Swing recently wrote, quoting him, "At the end of time, the author of life will return to this created and loved earth and demand accountability for what we did to enhance it or destroy it," end quote. Every day, George Shultz works to enhance God's creation and preserve human life on our planet. Growing up in farm country, which I did, I heard my father say frequently, "We don't just inherit this land from our fathers and mothers, we borrow it from our children." Thank you, George, for protecting God's creation and enhancing it for generations to come. And have a wonderful and happy birthday. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nunn. Sam, I'm going to turn now to Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Bill?
Well, through the years, I participated in a wealth of interesting events with George Shultz. Many of these occurred during the time we were working together with Sam and Henry Kissinger and Sid Drell to try to make the world free of nuclear weapons. We prepared op-eds, talks, movies promoting that goal. And perhaps most interesting, we had a White House meeting with President Obama on that goal. 1 month after his inauguration, Obama went to Prague and said that he was going to work to make the world free of nuclear weapons. I was thrilled, and I wondered at the time, had our work and writings influenced him? That question was soon answered when he invited the four of us to the White House, where we met in the Oval Office, and he told us of his interest in making the world free of weapons and how our work had influenced his move in that direction. Then he invited us to the White House Theater, where he was going to show our movie. The audience for that showing was the president and Michelle, the four of us and our wives, Obama's staff, and the senior military leaders. And he introduced the movie by saying it reflected his views, and he hoped it would come to reflect theirs as well. All that was well and good, but the highlight of that trip was Charlotte's presence. She had broken her leg just a few weeks before, but there was no way she was going to miss that meeting. So she had a walker, especially designed for the occasion. It was the most spectacular walker I have ever seen. And I will never forget the sight of her walking from the Hay Adams to the White House, pushing that spectacular walker and drawing admiring stares from Washingtonians on the way. So, George, I want to offer you my congratulations and cheers for your 100th birthday, but I also have cheers for the amazing Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. And now we'll turn to Provost Drell. Persis?
Thank you, Condi. So I have to start by saying that I'm here with this incredibly distinguished group to talk about Secretary Shultz's contributions to nuclear security, because my father is no longer with us. And that's really too bad, because I know that celebrating his friend George's 100th birthday would have given him such great pleasure. So I will do my best, but I will do it from my perspective as the daughter. I do hope you will understand that when I refer to Secretary Shultz as George, I mean no disrespect. There was only one George mentioned in the Drell household, and the name was always spoken with just incredibly deep affection. So from a daughter's perspective, this all starts with what strikes me as a pretty unlikely friendship. And in this case, it's about an unlikely friendship that formed late in life for two individuals who together and along with some influential friends took on one of the most important world issues in modern times, the existential threat of nuclear weapons. So the year was 1990. My dad, Sidney Drell, had enjoyed a long and pretty distinguished career as a physicist at Stanford up at SLAC, and he'd focused a growing part of his attention on the technical and policy aspects of nuclear security and arms control for over 3 decades at that point. George Shultz left government service in 1989 after serving for cabinet posts and came to Stanford as a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institute. And it was at Stanford that he met my dad because someone in Washington, and I think it was Paul Nitze, told him he should look up Sid Drell. And I just can't imagine that this was love at first sight, because on the surface, they didn't seem to have a whole lot in common. They came from very different spheres. George, the eminent economist, statesman, businessman, and my dad, physicist, academic for his entire career. And I suspect they might have had their political differences, but over time they bonded and became the closest of friends. So first of all, they were tigers. There's been a lot of reference to tigers. George, class of 42, my dad, class of 47. And I think their first collaborative work together was a joint letter to the Princeton Alumni Weekly in 1991 to argue against a proposal to get rid of Princeton's senior thesis requirement. That's the sort of thing that's dear to the heart of a provost. And while it seems that friendship and mutual respect were first and foremost the basis of the relationship, George and my dad also found a common ground in their desire to see the elimination of nuclear weapons. George lured my dad down to Hoover, where my dad became a senior fellow by courtesy in '98, and Hoover became their joint base of operations as they challenged conventional wisdom on how to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons. Famously, in 2008, George co-authored with my distinguished fellow panelists here the opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal that called on governments to embrace the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons and outlining a realistic strategy for getting to zero. I know my dad was deeply involved. My esteemed panelists have and will tell that part of the story much better than I, because they were in the room where it happened, so to speak. Now, in 2020, I think we must still hold on to the hope that we will see that world one day, although I believe the path forward is getting harder, not easier with time. George's vision, his leadership, his energy, his commitment to this cause are nothing short of extraordinary. George, you continue to inspire us all. You are a great American hero. But on a personal note, I just have to say how much my father valued his friendship with you, how the friendship with you and Charlotte, that was a source of joy for both of my parents. And it was just been a personal honor for me to get to know the both of you. And you, George, introduced my dad to Susan Southworth, who became a member of our family, and she is in all of our thoughts today. I want to end with just a little personal anecdote. George, you gave me one of the most unusual and best job recommendations I've ever had. My understanding of the story is that when Stanford President Tessier-Levine told you that he had decided to appoint me as president, George, you said, "That's fine, Mark, that's great. Yeah, fine scientist, fine leader. But what she really does well is bake a great apple pie." I am so deeply honored to have had the privilege of baking a pie, more than one actually, for George Shultz. Thank you, George, for all you've done and continue to do to make the world a better place. You have an astonishing legacy of contributions to humanity. Happy 100th birthday and many, many happy returns. And thank you so much for your friendship with my father.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Persis. And now I'm going to ask Henry Kissinger, the Honorable Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State and great friend of Secretary Shultz's. Henry, would you take the mic?
There is no person, except possibly my wife, who has had a greater impact on my life than George Shultz. We met over 50 years ago when he was chair at OMB and I was security advisor. And I went to see him to learn something about the oil market. This was a time when oil was $1 a barrel. But George developed a vision of the challenges and the difficulties and the necessities we would face over the next few years that changed not only my attitude towards the oil market, which I did not deal with much in my position, but with the impact it would have on the Middle East and on the world. So, altering my perspective and elevating my sights has been the enormous contribution that George has made to my life as he uplifted those around him and helped define directions for America. He then became Secretary of Treasury, and we worked closely together through the crises of the oil situation. And the challenge of the Middle East outbreaks of military operations that took place. So it did not take very long before I could look at George as an inspiration, as a mentor, whom I consulted about key issues of American policy and key purposes that we should pursue. We, of course, then, as time went on, the issues that became most fundamental were the relationships of the great powers to each other and the challenge of nuclear weapons. The dilemma of the nuclear age is that we must never neglect our defenses, and we can never permit another country to be in a position to pressure us. But it is also true that the use of weapons of mass destruction has consequences for all of humanity, and that the limitations of these weapons has to be an inherent attribute of national policy and of national strategy. George has had the courage to act on this truism as Secretary of State and to go beyond it by starting dialogues and negotiations in which enemies or potential adversaries that had the capacity to destroy each other understood that without limiting their capacities in some way, and without being in contact with whoever had the greatest potentially hostile capabilities, the world would become an increasingly dangerous place. And George provided through all this period also an inspiration to remember that these security issues were part of a living set of societies, and that one has to understand their demographic and cultural evolutions. So side by side with being a proverbial Marine and dedicated to the security of our country, he committed himself to the unprecedented task of having the adversarial groups, whether they were Russia for a while, and now it appears as if China has some of these capabilities, to draw them into a dialogue on which the human progress and survival depends. And he did this not only by conducting policies, but by inspiring people to work with him and to think of options that would not occur naturally in the day-to-day appearances, and to look at dangers that can arise, but also opportunities that could present themselves. So while he's working on a high priority project, there is always something else about which he will call you and tell you, you really ought to think about this. Unless you don't take his advice, he'll invite you to Hoover conferences, where he assembles the most interested and interesting people to discuss it. At a very critical moment in our history, when President Nixon faced the possible disintegration of his administration, I went to George Shultz. I was Secretary of State then, to see what could be done for a transitional period until the structure of the White House could be reassembled. and George and Arthur Burns and I met regularly for a 2-week period until General Haig came back as Chief of Staff of the White House and assumed these functions. But it was George then to whom I turned first. And it has been George throughout the many decades that have passed since then. So I do not want to exceed the time limits, but I want to say everybody has referred to George's sense of humor, which is tremendous. But George's capacity for friendship and for his ability to understand the deeper values is crucial. And then there is Charlotte. I have had the honor of being invited every year to a party that Charlotte gives for that occasion. And she has managed to arrange each party on the theme of some country. And she knew that I liked mariachi music. So she had every year a mariachi band dressed in the clothing of the country she was celebrating. And those people that were invited were colleagues also of many other common activities. So George and Charlotte, your friendship has been a key element in my life. And I hope we can continue for many years, and that you will thereby serve our country and the world. I was going to say, I hope to the biblical age of 120. But then I thought, why should I put a limit to the grace of God? Thank you very much for your lifetime of friendship, and above all, for your inspiration to this country.
Thank you so much. And I want to just thank everyone now for the wonderful remarks about Secretary Shultz and George Shultz and Charlotte. And now to end our program, George, you have had many homes, as you can see, and many friends, and you are loved in so many places. But we wanted to have representation from the place that you now reside, the place that you come into your office on a daily basis, and the place that we hope very soon you'll be able to come into that office again. And so I've asked to join me on the screen the John Rizian and Tom Gilligan, the most recent directors of the Hoover Institution, who would like to say a word to you on behalf of all of your friends and colleagues and admirers at the Hoover Institution. John?
Thank you, Condi. I'm going to simply say happy birthday, George. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to offer a birthday message to you on your centennial year, which essentially coincides with the founding of the Hoover Institution, both 100. And as you know, I was selected to succeed Glenn Campbell as director of the Hoover Institution in 1989, and shortly thereafter, we were fortunate and honored to welcome you to the Hoover Institution as Distinguished Fellow, the first fellow at that time to have such a title. And here we are, 30 years later. Your intellectual contributions over the last 30 years have been sensational. Throughout your professional life to date, you have demonstrated incredible vision, diligence, and energy. Of course, prior to your Hoover experience, you amassed an amazing portfolio of knowledge and experience, which all of us are fully aware. These earlier experiences have amplified your immediate impact on the institution, and we have benefited profoundly. During these years at Hoover, your experience, as well as current focus at Hoover, continues to be remarkable, contributing to ideas defining a free society. Your continuing accumulation of knowledge and your ongoing projection of wisdom has been and continues to be rational, consistent, sensible, and clear. The growth of your intellectual and professional commitment from the beginning has been absolutely stunning. And amazingly, your interests continue to flourish. My goodness, you have recently released 3 books titled Thinking About the Future, Issues on My Mind, and A Hinge of History, Governance in an Emerging New World. These are big topics. The latter book was co-authored with James Timby. Interestingly, these visionary presentations are naturally consistent with your philosophical outlook across so many topical policy issues. During my time serving as director, I was pleased and proud to observe that Hoover Fellows naturally engaged and interacted significantly with colleagues as part of generating ideas defining a free society. As our colleagues reached out to you over time and vice versa, you welcomed such interactions. You engaged colleagues in policy discussions, which often led to joint essays or books intended for broad dissemination. The resulting collegiality continues to be remarkable at Hoover, with ideas that are positive, productive, meaningful, and hopefully impactful. Typically, celebrating a birthday is associated with a gift to the recipient. Yet this is your birthday. And you are the one who has presented an amazing gift to our institution. Well, hopefully this will lead to the gift that keeps on giving. All I can say is that the institution has flourished over these 30 years, and you have contributed significantly. Again, sir, a very happy birthday to you.
Thank you, John. Tom?
Well, good day, everybody. George, happy birthday. We're very excited and hoping you're celebrating the day well. During my time as director, I so appreciated the contributions and leadership you showed to the mission of the Hoover Institution. Your intellectual heft is unparalleled, remains so. And it was really clear to me how much energy and commitment you placed in generating ideas in service of a free society. I also very much appreciated the efforts you took to promote community, both at Hoover, at Stanford, and across the world. Christy and I, in particular, are thankful for the invitations that we have received to parties put on at your house, produced by, of course, the incomparable Charlotte. We will never forget those, and they are the best times we've ever had in our lives. So we really appreciate that. Now, others today have done a great job cataloging the contributions that you've made over the first 100 years of your life. Let me end by just saying congratulations. Those accomplishments are quite substantial. And let me wish you the best and encourage you to make even more contributions in the second 100 years of your life.
Thank you very much. Let me ask if George and Charlotte would like to just wave and say anything to our good friends.
Let me just thank everybody for coming out and making your comments. I realize in listening to people how much I've been benefited by being part of a team, because I've done things, but it's always interaction with other people, and you learn from them and work with them, and that's been a key for me. So thank you all for all that kind of stuff. And it's been nice to hear the references to Charlotte, because she is a spark plug all the time, and that's what you need. So thank you all very much. And don't forget, trust is the coin of the realm.
If I may?
Please.
Hard to follow George Shultz, right? But I follow him everywhere. Thank you. Today was wonderful to hear all the accolades about George. Of course, some of them I knew, but they were enhanced today. When I hear these things, I think, I've always thought how lucky I am to be with George, but every word you said today, I've got to do a better job of being a better girl, because I'm very, very lucky. Thank you for the accolades that you gave to me. I just follow instructions from George. I have said, he's had all these secretarial jobs, and in my protocol jobs, I've always thought of him as my secret weapon. So I've called him my secretary, but I want to tell you, he does not take dictation. So today also, I loved being a commandant. The Queen of England had given me an award where I am a commander, but I see today that I've been uplifted to a higher rank, and I thank you very much for that. In these times that we are together, George has said it was like a honeymoon, and I thought, where are the pina coladas and where's the sand? But they've been wonderful times that we've had a time to talk together. And one day I said to George, what makes you what you are, and what made you do all the things that you've done? And he gave that Shultz stare, which I'm sure you've all seen, looks into the future, and then it goes click, click, click. You can probably hear it. And he said, trust. Trust is the coin of the realm. And it was so, it told the story. And I said, you've got to write this down for your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. We have 9. And it's important for them to know. So he has written a little pamphlet. And if you'd like for me to send it to you, I could. But thank you for all that you said for George. And thank you for saying nice things about me. And just remember, next year, buy something new to wear, because there's going to be a party. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. And we look forward to that 101st. And if we can start to bring everybody back on. I just want to say, George, I am so proud to be the director of the Hoover Institution. And I know that you're going to be sure that I do it the right way. So thank you very much for what you've done so far and what you're going to do in the future. And I'd
like to make one other comment.
Of course.
And I see Persis here. And one of my great influences on me was Sid Drell. And somehow, when I was Secretary of State, Paul Nissy kept talking about some guy named Sid Drell. So when I got back to campus, I called him up, and we had lunch together, and we just clicked. And we had this wonderful friendship.
went way beyond technical things, but his office was where I could stop by. Mine was not far away. And we still have Sid with us because in the conference room where we went when we had more than just the two of us, Sid was there a lot. So we have a little bookcase in his picture. So Sid remains with us. He was just a wonderful person, Persis.
Thank you, George. And George, that sums it up because everybody here has talked about your inspiring work and your great leadership, but also you are among friends here because you are such a great friend. And I just want to thank you personally for having been such a great friend to me and a mentor. And I look forward to many more years of exactly that. Now, I'm going to try something, which is we're going to sing happy birthday, but everybody's going to be on mute because Zoom has this lag. And so we'll all be singing all over each other. Now, I'm a pianist, not a singer, but I'm going to sing and I want all of you to follow silently. So, George, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear George. Happy birthday to you.
You can sing.
Thanks everybody for being a part of this wonderful celebration. Charlotte, we take up your charge to be there for 101 next year in person. All the best to everyone. Stay safe and the very happiest of holidays.
Thanks for your friendship.